with us today is UT Miller, joining us from 1941, and Mrs. Mia Geese, joining us from 1943. Thank you, ladies. Ms. Miller, let's start with you. Your family moved here to Tennessee from Kentucky during the Depression, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. Beginning our life in Kentucky was a very nice life, very content with it. Both my parents had jobs. They were both college educated, which is very rare at this time. That's actually where my name comes from. You guys might have been wondering. It's kind of a strange name. My parents actually were able to go to the University of Texas, and they're very proud of being able to go to such a prestigious school. So they named me UT after that.
For University of Texas. Do they ever call you University for short?
No, just UT. But we had a really great life there in Kentucky. But they left those jobs to pursue the oil industry. There's actually oil in Kentucky at that time. Not many people know that. And so we chased after the oil. But unfortunately, the oil ran out about the same time that the Depression started to hit that part of the country really hard. And so we were left without jobs, and we were left without a home. And so at that time, my mother was receiving a call to the ministry very strongly.
Your mother?
Yes. And we moved to McKenzie so she could go to the seminary, Bethel Seminary there.
Was she the only woman in seminary?
Yeah, she was the only woman in her class. There were a few other women at the school, but she was actually one of the first ordained women ministers of that denomination.
Interesting.
And so we got to McKenzie, and unfortunately my father was not able to find a job there. At that time, if you did have a job, you weren't making very much money, and it was not uncommon to not have a job. So he actually had to hit the road as a traveling salesman. And what little money he did make had to go back into the car he drove, and gas and repairs and things like that. And I don't think he ever felt like he provided for us properly, and I don't think he ever felt good about it.
That had to be very hard for him. Well, and if he wasn't able to provide, what did your family do for money?
My mother actually, we were very blessed. She was able to find positions with the WPA, it's the Works Progress Administration. That's one of the programs that President Roosevelt put forth in his New Deal to help us through the Depression. And she's had two different positions there. Her first position was as a seamstress, and she helped sew clothing for people who were even less fortunate than us. And then her second position, she actually worked teaching literacy to illiterate people.
I didn't realize that any of the works projects were that small. I thought they were all kind of large government projects, big construction projects.
Well, there are plenty of those too. One of the most important to us in Tennessee is, of course, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they built dams to and outfitted them to provide us with electricity, hydroelectric power. And of course, in McKenzie, we actually had CCC camp. That's the Civilian Conservation Corps. That's one of the most famous branches of the works projects. And so I saw those boys in town from time to time, and they were a little rough for my taste, but I guess that happens when you have that many young men living together. And they lived on the outskirts of town, and they had like a little military-style camp there, and they built a lot of things in our area. They built schools, post offices, state parks, national parks, roads, bridges, things like that.
Well, it seems like those projects did so much good for the United States, but I understand that there was still controversy about them.
Absolutely. I don't think that the government can ever make a decision that all of its citizens are going to agree with. That's just part of living in a democracy. And Mr. Roosevelt did try to make sure that all of the projects were going to give back in some way, that they weren't just a job for someone to do. They were actually going to help by building things or teaching or building of our culture, things like that. But there's a lot of doubts, one of which was how to pay for it. Of course, if the government's going to pay that many people's wages, that money's got to come from somewhere, and we did rack up quite a bit of debt in those years. Another one was the fear of it being too much like communism or socialism or something like that. That was a very big fear. We had just gotten out of the Great War, and we knew everything that was going on in Europe and some of those awful countries, and so it was a fear that America was too much like those places.
I can see that, and it's interesting that you say debating how much the federal government ought to be involved, because that seems to be one of those arguments that's been going on throughout American history, before your time, and it will go on after your time too. But it's interesting that you bring up the fear of socialism and communism. That's a perfect lead into our next guest.